The richest people in the room aren't always the ones with the most money. Sometimes they're the ones who still remember the difference between right and wrong. I didn't know the man sitting alone in the corner booth was one of the most powerful people in New York. To me, he was just another customer in an expensive charcoal suit, quietly finishing a cup of black coffee, while everyone else in Sullivan's family diner pretended not to stare. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of cold drizzle that turned Manhattan sidewalks into mirrors reflecting yellow taxi lights and gray skies. My name is Lily Carter, and I was 8 years old. Every day after school, I sat in the last booth near the kitchen doing homework while my mom worked double shifts carrying trays she could barely lift after 12 hours on her feet. Mom always told me the diner was safer than staying alone in our apartment. Besides, she liked knowing she could glance across the room and see me smiling over my math workbook instead of worrying about whether the heat would stop working again. We didn't have much. Our apartment was barely 600 square feet. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, and every winter the windows whistled whenever the wind blew hard. Mom worked 2 jobs and still counted every dollar before buying groceries. But she had one rule she repeated so often I could hear it even when she wasn't speaking. "Lily," she'd say while brushing my hair every morning, "we can survive being poor, but we cannot survive losing our character." I didn't fully understand what character meant back then. I only knew it seemed more important to her than money. The man in the charcoal suit stood quietly, nodded once to my mom, left cash beneath the check holder, and walked toward the door without looking back. His movements were calm, almost effortless, like someone who never needed to hurry because the world always waited for him. A few seconds later, another customer waved my mom over, and the lunch rush swallowed everyone's attention. That's when I noticed it. A thick brown envelope resting beside the salt shaker. At first I thought it was paperwork. Then the corner slipped open as the air conditioner kicked on, revealing neat stacks of crisp $100 bills. My heart stopped. I'd never seen that much cash before. Not in movies. Not even in pictures. It looked unreal, like something that belonged inside a bank vault instead of a neighborhood diner with cracked vinyl booths and scratched coffee mugs. I glanced toward the front windows. The man was already stepping into a black SUV parked along the curb. Around me, nobody had seen the envelope. Or maybe they hadn't looked carefully enough. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It felt surprisingly heavy. Heavy enough to change someone's life. Heavy enough to pay our rent for years. Heavy enough to make every problem disappear. Then I remembered my mother's voice as clearly as if she were whispering beside me. "If it isn't yours, sweetheart, it never will be." I looked through the rain-streaked glass one more time. The SUV's brake lights glowed bright red. Without thinking another second, I clutched the envelope tightly against my chest, pushed open the diner's front door, and ran straight into the cold October rain. I splashed through puddles that soaked my sneakers almost instantly, holding the envelope with both hands beneath my jacket the way another child might protect a favorite stuffed animal. The cold rain stung my cheeks, but I barely noticed. All I could see were the glowing red brake lights at the end of the block. "Wait!" I shouted with every bit of air my small lungs could manage. My voice disappeared beneath the traffic and the steady hiss of tires rolling across wet pavement. The black SUV had already started pulling away from the curb. For one terrifying second, I thought I had lost him forever. Then a delivery truck eased into the intersection, forcing every vehicle to stop at the red light. I ran harder than I ever had before. My backpack bounced against my shoulders, my homework scattered somewhere inside, and my legs burned with every step. By the time I reached the SUV, I was completely out of breath. The windows were so dark I could not see inside. I knocked once. Nothing happened. I knocked again, louder this time. A moment later, the passenger door opened, and a tall man wearing a tailored black coat stepped out. He looked down at me with polite confusion. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" he asked. I shook my head so quickly that wet strands of blonde hair slapped against my face. The man inside forgot something. I held up the envelope with both hands. The man's expression changed immediately. His eyes dropped to the envelope, then returned to my face. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. He left it on the table. For several long seconds, he simply stared at me, as though waiting for me to laugh and admit it was a joke. Instead, I extended my arms farther. "It belongs to him." The man hesitated before opening the rear door. The warm scent of leather drifted into the rainy afternoon. The customer from the diner turned his head toward me. Up close, he looked younger than I first thought, perhaps in his late 30s. His dark hair was neatly combed, and calm blue eyes studied me with an expression I could not understand. He accepted the envelope slowly, almost carefully, as if it might disappear the moment he touched it. He opened it just enough to glance inside before closing it again. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. I nodded. "Money." A tiny smile touched the corner of his mouth. "A great deal of money." I nodded again. "Yes, sir." He continued watching me through the open door while rain collected along the edge of the roof above us. "You could have kept it," he said. "No one would have known." His words confused me. I blinked several times before answering. I would have known. Something shifted in his face. It was not surprise exactly. It felt deeper than that, like someone remembering a song they had not heard in many years. The man beside the door remained perfectly still. Even the driver glanced into the rearview mirror. Nobody spoke. Finally, the customer reached into his wallet and removed several crisp bills. "This belongs to you now," he said gently. I immediately stepped back and folded my hands behind my back. "No, thank you." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Why not?" I swallowed hard before repeating the lesson my mother had taught me since I was old enough to understand. Words. Doing the right thing is not supposed to cost someone else money. The rain continued falling between us, but for the first time since I had left the diner, the entire world seemed strangely quiet. I expected him to nod politely and drive away. Instead, he lowered the money back into the envelope without taking his eyes off me. There was something unusual about the silence inside the vehicle. It was not awkward. It felt thoughtful, almost heavy, as if everyone sitting there had forgotten what they were supposed to say next. The man finally leaned back against the leather seat. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lily Carter, sir." He repeated it quietly, as though committing it to memory. "And your parents?" I smiled without thinking. "Just my mom. She works at Sullivan's Family Diner." His gaze softened for the briefest moment. "She taught you not to keep what does not belong to you." I nodded proudly. "She says honesty is free, so everybody can afford it." The driver looked down toward the steering wheel, hiding a faint smile. The man standing beside the open door remained expressionless, but I noticed his shoulders relax. The customer looked out through the rain-speckled window toward the diner across the street before returning his attention to me. "Does your mother know you ran after my car?" I looked back toward the restaurant where I could barely see my mother's worried silhouette searching through the front window. Probably by now. A quiet laugh escaped him. It was warm and unexpected, completely different from the calm, unreadable expression he had worn inside the diner. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small white business card, holding it between two fingers before pausing. For a second, he seemed to change his mind. Instead of handing it to me, he slipped it back into his pocket. "Never mind," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he looked toward the man standing outside. "Ethan." "Yes, sir." "Find out everything about the Carter family." Ethan did not appear surprised. Discreetly, especially discreetly. My forehead wrinkled. Did I do something wrong? The customer immediately turned back to me, his expression gentle enough to erase the fear growing inside my chest. "No, Lily. You reminded me of something I thought this city had forgotten." I did not understand what he meant, but something about the way he said it made me feel strangely safe. He closed the envelope and rested it beside him. "Go back inside before your mother worries herself sick." I smiled. "Yes, sir." As I turned to leave, he called after me one last time. "Lily." I looked over my shoulder. "Thank you." I waved before running back across the wet sidewalk, careful not to slip on the rain-slick pavement. Through the diner window, I saw my mother rush toward the entrance the moment I reached the door. She wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Do not ever scare me like that again," she whispered, brushing damp hair away from my face. "I am sorry, Mom." "Where did you go?" I glanced toward the black SUV just as it pulled away from the curb. "Someone forgot something important." She searched my face for several seconds before kissing my forehead. "You did the right thing." I smiled because hearing those words from her somehow felt better than earning all the money in that envelope. Neither of us noticed that 2 blocks away, the black SUV had stopped beneath a traffic light. Inside, Vincent Romano watched the diner through rain-covered glass, while Ethan quietly read information appearing on a tablet. "Sarah Carter," Ethan said. 32 years old. Waitress. Widow. No criminal record. 2 jobs. Late rent notices. Medical bills from 3 years ago. Elementary school reports describe Lily as exceptionally honest. Vincent remained silent for a long moment before speaking so softly that only Ethan could hear. Tomorrow, I want to know who taught that little girl to stay that good in a city that rewards the opposite. The next morning felt completely ordinary, which made what happened even stranger. I walked into school carrying the same faded blue backpack, wearing the same sneakers with the loose shoelace Mom kept promising to replace after payday. The rain had disappeared overnight, leaving the playground covered with tiny puddles that reflected the bright autumn sun. By lunchtime, I had almost forgotten about the man in the black SUV. To me, he was simply someone who had misplaced an envelope and gotten it back. I did not know that, across the city, Vincent Romano had already canceled 2 business meetings because he could not stop thinking about an 8-year-old girl who believed honesty mattered more than $50,000. Ethan entered his office carrying a thin folder instead of the usual stack of reports. "Everything you requested is here," he said, placing it carefully on the polished walnut desk. Vincent opened the folder without a word. There were school attendance records, neighborhood photographs, employment history, and a few pictures taken from a respectful distance. In every photograph, Sarah Carter looked tired but smiling. In every photograph, Lily was holding either a library book or her mother's hand. There were no luxury vacations, no expensive birthdays, no signs of hidden wealth, just a mother and daughter trying their best every single day. Vincent paused on one page. Perfect attendance. Ethan nodded. Even during the winter when the subway was delayed for almost a week. Vincent turned another page. Honor roll. Another page showed a note from Lily's 3rd-grade teacher. She shares her lunch whenever another student forgets theirs. Vincent leaned back slowly. Interesting. Ethan folded his hands. There is something else. Vincent looked up. Their landlord has increased the rent twice in 18 months. Sarah is behind on payments, but every record shows she always catches up eventually. She refuses charity programs unless she qualifies through normal application procedures. Vincent closed the folder. Pride. Dignity, Ethan corrected quietly. Vincent did not argue. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, watching thousands of strangers hurry through another ordinary morning. Somewhere among them, a little girl was probably sitting in a classroom solving multiplication problems without realizing she had disrupted the routine of a man who rarely questioned anything. After several minutes, Vincent spoke without turning around. "I want to know if yesterday was luck or character." Ethan already understood. "You want another test?" Vincent nodded once. Not to trap her, to understand her. That afternoon, Sullivan's family diner filled with the familiar sounds of clattering dishes, friendly conversations, and fresh coffee brewing behind the counter. I sat in my usual booth working on a reading assignment while Mom hurried from table to table with her warm smile that somehow survived even the busiest shifts. Around 4 o'clock, a man wearing a navy baseball cap entered alone and ordered a slice of apple pie with coffee. He looked ordinary enough that nobody paid him much attention. When he stood to leave 20 minutes later, something slipped quietly from the inside pocket of his jacket onto the floor beside the booth. I noticed it immediately. A thick leather wallet rested against the leg of the chair, untouched by everyone walking past. I picked it up before anyone accidentally stepped on it. It felt heavier than any wallet I had ever held. I looked toward the front door where the man had already reached the sidewalk. Without opening it, without counting what might be inside, I tightened my grip and hurried after him once again. The man in the navy baseball cap had almost reached the corner before I caught up with him. "Sir," I called, lifting the wallet high enough for him to see. He stopped immediately and turned around with a puzzled expression that looked surprisingly believable. "Did you lose this?" I asked as I reached him, breathing a little harder than before. His eyes dropped to the wallet in my hands, then widened as if he had only just realized it was missing. "Well, would you look at that?" he said with a grateful smile. I thought it was gone forever. He accepted it carefully, opened it for only a second, then looked back at me. "Everything is still here." I smiled. "That is good." He chuckled softly. "Young lady, do you even know what was inside?" I shook my head. "No, sir." "You never looked?" "Mom says privacy belongs to everyone, even strangers." For a moment, the man simply stared at me. Then he reached into the wallet and pulled out a $50 bill. "Please take this. You earned it." I immediately took one small step backward. No, thank you. He blinked. Are you sure? Yes, sir. Most adults would not refuse. I thought about that for a second before answering honestly. Maybe they need it more than I do. The man laughed quietly, but there was sadness behind his smile. And what if you needed it? I looked toward the diner where I could see my mother through the front window balancing 3 dinner plates on one tray. If I need help, I ask my mom. I do not keep things that belong to somebody else. He thanked me once more before walking away. But instead of disappearing around the corner, he crossed the street and entered a black sedan waiting beneath a maple tree with bright orange leaves. Inside the car, Vincent Romano sat silently in the rear seat. The man in the baseball cap handed him the wallet without saying a word. Vincent opened it. Every dollar remained exactly where Ethan had placed it that morning. She never opened it, the man said. Vincent nodded slowly. Not even once. She also refused the reward. A faint smile appeared on Vincent's face, though it carried more admiration than amusement. That makes twice. Ethan looked over from the passenger seat. You have your answer. Vincent rested the wallet on his lap, staring out the window as Lily disappeared back inside the diner. No, he replied quietly. Now I have a question. Ethan waited. How does a child remain this honest while growing up with so little? No one inside the car had an answer. Across the street, the dinner rush had begun. I slipped back into my booth, expecting everything to continue as usual, but I noticed Mom standing unusually still beside the cash register. She was speaking with the owner of the diner in a hushed voice. Even from across the room, I could tell something was wrong. Her shoulders looked tense, and she kept twisting the corner of her order pad between her fingers, something she only did when she was worried. A few minutes later, she forced another smile and returned to serving customers, but I recognized the difference immediately. It was the smile she used whenever she wanted to protect me from adult problems. That evening, after the last customer had gone home, we walked the 12 blocks to our apartment together beneath the cool autumn sky. Halfway there, I reached for her hand. Mom. She squeezed my fingers gently. Yes, sweetheart. Is everything okay? She hesitated before smiling again, softer this time. Everything will be okay. It was a beautiful answer. It was also the first time in my life I realized those words did not always mean the same thing. High above the city lights, Vincent Romano stood alone in his office overlooking Manhattan, holding a copy of Sarah Carter's financial report. One overdue notice had caught his attention. One impossible choice was approaching a family that had never asked anyone for anything. Quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "No child who values honesty this much should ever have to wonder whether tomorrow still has room for hope." The next morning began with the sound of our mailbox slamming shut somewhere downstairs. Mom always checked it before leaving for work, and I always waited by the tiny kitchen table while she sorted through grocery coupons, utility bills, and advertisements we never needed. That morning, however, she stopped smiling. She stared at one envelope longer than the others before quietly folding it and slipping it into her purse. I pretended not to notice because children often understand more than adults realize. During breakfast, she talked about my spelling test and reminded me to wear my jacket because the weather forecast called for cooler temperatures by the afternoon. She laughed at one of my silly jokes and kissed the top of my head before we left the apartment, but her eyes looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Later that day, after school, I hurried back to Sullivan's family diner with my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. Mom was already serving customers, moving with the same graceful determination she carried every day, yet I noticed her glancing toward the front window every few minutes as though expecting someone to arrive. Across town, Vincent Romano was reading the latest update Ethan had prepared. There was nothing dramatic inside the report. No scandals. No hidden secrets. Just numbers. Rent due in 6 days. Savings account nearly empty. Medical payments from Sarah's late husband's illness had quietly followed her for years despite her best efforts. Every bill had been paid honestly, only slowly. Vincent closed the folder and rested both hands on his desk. She has never stopped trying, he said. Ethan nodded. She has also never accepted assistance she did not earn. Vincent walked toward the window overlooking the city below. People often mistake dignity for stubbornness. Ethan waited. What would you like me to do? Vincent remained silent for nearly a full minute before answering. Nothing that would embarrass her. Nothing that would make her feel indebted. Ethan understood immediately. Anonymous. Vincent finally turned around. Completely. That evening, after the dinner rush had ended, Sarah returned to the apartment, carrying 2 bags of discounted groceries. She unlocked the front door, set everything on the kitchen counter, and opened her purse to organize the bills she planned to pay after Lily had gone to bed. Her fingers suddenly froze. The overdue rent notice she had folded that morning was gone. She searched every pocket inside her purse, then checked her jacket and grocery bags before finally shaking her head in confusion. "That is strange," she whispered. The following morning, there was another envelope waiting inside the mailbox. Sarah expected another reminder. Instead, she unfolded a single sheet of paper from the property management office. According to the letter, her rent account showed a 0 balance. It also stated that an accounting error had recently been corrected and apologized for any unnecessary concern the previous notice may have caused. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. Nothing about it made sense. She immediately called the office, expecting someone to explain the mistake. After a brief conversation, she thanked the receptionist politely and ended the call even more puzzled than before. According to their records, everything had already been verified. There was nothing left to pay. That night, as she tucked me into bed, I noticed the worry lines around her eyes had softened for the first time in weeks. "Mom," I whispered, pulling the blanket closer beneath my chin. "You look happier today." She smiled gently and brushed my hair away from my forehead. Sometimes life surprises you in the nicest ways. Neither of us knew that several blocks away, Vincent Romano stood beside the window of his office watching the lights of Manhattan shimmer against the evening sky. He did not ask for gratitude. He did not expect recognition. He only hoped that, somewhere in one small apartment, a little girl could fall asleep believing that doing the right thing would never leave her completely alone. 3 days passed without another surprise, and little by little life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Mom still woke before sunrise, still packed my lunch in the same blue container with the cracked lid, and still tied my scarf twice whenever the morning air turned cold. Yet something had changed inside our tiny apartment. The heavy silence that had followed every stack of unpaid bills had disappeared. Mom laughed more often. She hummed while washing dishes. She even stopped apologizing every time we walked past a bakery without buying dessert. I did not understand why everything suddenly felt lighter, but I loved the way hope sounded in her voice. Late Friday afternoon, Sullivan's family diner buzzed with the usual crowd escaping the chilly weather. I sat in my favorite booth reading a library book while the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. The bell above the entrance chimed softly. I looked up and immediately recognized the man from the rainy afternoon. He wore another perfectly tailored dark suit, but this time he came alone. There was no black SUV waiting outside the window, no group of serious-looking men following behind him. He simply walked to the same corner booth, ordered black coffee, and quietly thanked my mother when she placed the cup on the table. Mom treated him like every other customer. She had no idea who he really was. I watched him for several minutes before returning to my book, but every now and then I caught him glancing toward our booth with a thoughtful expression. After finishing his coffee, he stood and slowly walked toward the front counter instead of leaving. "Excuse me," he said politely to my mother. "May I ask you something?" "Of course," Mom replied with her usual warm smile. "Your daughter returned something very valuable to me a few days ago." Mom looked surprised. "That was you." He nodded. She reminded me that honesty still exists. My mother's cheeks turned slightly pink with embarrassment. She only did what I hope any child would do. Vincent smiled gently. "I'm not sure that is true anymore." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully placed a cream-colored envelope on the counter. "This is not a reward," he said before she could refuse. "It is an opportunity." Mom frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "Inside is information about a private education foundation." That part was true, although the foundation happened to be financed entirely through companies Vincent controlled. If Lily is ever accepted, every dollar of her education will be covered from elementary school through college. Mom immediately shook her head. "That is far too generous." Vincent did not argue. Instead, he answered with remarkable calm. "I believe society spends too much time investing in buildings and too little time investing in people." She looked down at the unopened envelope without touching it. "I cannot accept charity." Vincent met her eyes with quiet respect. "Neither could I. If I were in your place. He paused before continuing. That is why this is not charity. Your daughter has already demonstrated qualities that cannot be taught in any classroom. Integrity, courage, compassion. We simply want to invest in someone who already earned our admiration. The words hung gently in the air between them. Mom remained silent for several seconds before finally picking up the envelope with both hands. She did not promise anything. She did not immediately agree. Instead, she whispered the simplest words she could find. Thank you for believing in her. Vincent glanced toward me one last time. I smiled and gave him a small wave. He returned it with the faintest smile before quietly walking out into the crisp autumn evening, never noticing that, for the first time in years, Sarah Carter held the future in her hands without feeling that she had sacrificed her dignity to reach it. The envelope stayed on our kitchen table all weekend. Mom did not rush to open it again after reading the information the first time. Instead, she kept looking at it whenever she walked past, as though it carried a question she was afraid to answer. On Sunday evening, after finishing my homework, I found her sitting quietly by the window with a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The city lights shimmered across the glass, and for the first time, I realized adults sometimes spent more time thinking than speaking. Mom, I asked softly, are you worried? She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that searched for the right words before finding them. A little. I climbed onto the chair beside her. Because of the school? She nodded. Sometimes wonderful opportunities feel frightening. I tilted my head. Why? She brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from my face. Because accepting kindness can feel harder than surviving without it. I thought about that for several seconds before asking the question that had been living inside my mind ever since the man in the dark suit walked back into the diner. Do you think he is a good person? Mom looked toward the city outside the window before answering. I think people are more complicated than good or bad. Sometimes they carry burdens we cannot see. What matters is what they choose to do with the power they have. Across Manhattan, Vincent Romano stood alone inside a quiet room that almost no one else ever entered. It was not his office. It was a small private library hidden behind a pair of walnut doors. Along one wall sat hundreds of books. On another rested a single framed photograph of a smiling little girl no older than 10. Her light brown hair danced in the wind, and she held a worn paperback book against her chest while laughing at someone standing behind the camera. Vincent picked up the frame with careful hands and stared at it for a long time. Ethan entered quietly but did not interrupt. After several moments, Vincent finally spoke. Do you remember Anna? Ethan nodded. Every year. Vincent's voice remained calm, but the sadness beneath it had never truly disappeared. She once found a wallet on a subway platform. Ethan remembered the story well. She turned it in without even checking the name. Vincent smiled faintly. She said the owner was probably more frightened than excited. Silence settled over the room again. Lily reminds you of her, Ethan said gently. Vincent lowered the photograph. Not because they look alike. He shook his head. Because they both believed honesty was normal. He walked toward the window overlooking the skyline, where thousands of lights stretched across the darkness like stars that had decided to live closer to the ground. I spent years convincing myself that integrity disappeared from this city. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. An 8-year-old girl proved I was wrong. The next afternoon, Mom finally mailed the application from the Education Foundation. She did not celebrate. She simply sealed the envelope, whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, and placed it into the blue mailbox outside the post office. As we walked home beneath golden leaves drifting through the crisp autumn air, she squeezed my hand and smiled. No matter what happens, she said, promise me one thing. What? Never let success change the reason people trust you. I nodded without hesitation. Neither of us noticed the familiar black sedan parked half a block away. Inside, Vincent watched only long enough to see the envelope disappear into the mailbox before quietly telling Ethan, the scholarship was never the real gift. Ethan glanced back. What was? Vincent smiled as the car pulled away. Hope that arrived without asking anyone to surrender their dignity first. 15 years passed more quickly than either of us expected. The tiny apartment with the peeling wallpaper became a memory. The long shifts at Sullivan's family diner finally came to an end, and the little girl who once chased a black SUV through the rain now stood backstage inside one of New York's most respected law schools wearing a navy graduation gown. My name would soon be called, and I would become the first lawyer in my family. The scholarship that had arrived when I was 8 years old had opened doors I never knew existed, but my mother never allowed me to forget that education was a privilege earned through character, not a prize handed to luck. She attended every school ceremony, every debate competition, and every graduation with the same proud smile she wore the day I learned to read my first chapter book. This day was no different. She sat near the front row with tears already forming in her eyes before the ceremony even began. Hidden several rows behind the families sat another familiar face, though very few people recognized him. Vincent Romano had declined every invitation to appear on stage or accept public recognition from the foundation that had quietly funded hundreds of scholarships over the years. He preferred the last row, where applause belonged to the students instead of the donors. His dark hair now carried streaks of silver, and the confidence that once filled every room had softened into something quieter. Age had not diminished his influence, but it had refined his understanding of what influence was truly meant to accomplish. Ethan took the seat beside him and handed over a small program listing the graduates. Vincent smiled when he found my name. "She kept her promise," he said softly. Ethan looked toward the stage. "No, she exceeded it." My name echoed through the auditorium, and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma while the audience applauded. As I reached the podium to deliver the student address, I looked out across hundreds of faces before taking a slow breath. When I was 8 years old, I began. Someone once trusted me with an opportunity that I did not fully understand. At the time, I believed the greatest gift anyone could receive was money. I was wrong. The greatest gift is having someone believe that your future is worth investing in before the rest of the world notices. The room became perfectly still. My mother taught me that honesty is free, which means everyone can afford it. Today I stand here because one act of integrity was met with one act of kindness, and together they changed 2 lives instead of one. I glanced toward my mother, whose tears now flowed freely, before my eyes drifted unknowingly toward the quiet man seated in the last row. Vincent did not wave. He simply smiled with quiet pride, knowing this moment had never belonged to him. When the ceremony ended, families gathered for photographs beneath the warm spring sunshine. By the time I finished hugging classmates and professors, the man in the last row had already disappeared. All that remained was a small white envelope resting with the dean's assistant, addressed simply to Lily Carter. Inside was a handwritten note without a signature. It read, "Never underestimate the quiet power of doing the right thing. Wealth changes circumstances. Character changes generations. Thank you for reminding one tired man that goodness still exists." I folded the note carefully and slipped it into the same wallet I carried every day. Years later, after opening a non-profit legal center dedicated to protecting children and struggling families, I framed those words inside my office where every young client could read them before walking through my door. Some people spend their lives searching for heroes who arrive wearing capes or carrying impossible strength. Mine walked into a neighborhood diner wearing a charcoal suit and quietly discovered that the smallest hands can carry the greatest truths. In the end, it was never the money that changed the future. It was the decision of one little girl to return something that was never hers, and the decision of one powerful man to answer honesty with hope instead of applause.